Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it a few moments for folks to virtually trickle in to the room. It's a narrow doorway, so we need a little bit of time for folks to come in. Good afternoon and welcome back to the Gender Equity Education Series 2023-24 offerings. We're so excited that you're back. This is a really enjoyable education series for me to plan with our steering committee, and I hope you enjoy it. The topic for this fall's offerings is leadership, broad topic. Today, we have Dr. Tiffany Love, who's going to speak to us about leading towards equity. In October, we're going to host a panel discussion on paths to leadership with some of our local leaders. And then in December, we're going to host an actually in-person networking lunch on the topic of everyday leaders. And these are people who create impact and change in our environment without having a formal leadership role or leadership position. So my question to you is, do you know any of these people? And if you do, will you please let me know? And we have a link here to a Qualtrics survey, which would just ask you to name some of those everyday leaders. And then I'm going to get in touch with them and ask them to join us in an active way during this December networking lunch. So please utilize that link and let me know who the everyday leaders are, those people who are making change and shaping your environment, even though they don't have a dean title or a vice chair title. I want to know about them. So let's elevate our everyday leaders. And I'm so excited to have Tiffany Love here with us today. This is just going to be a great session. But before we get started, and speaking of leadership, I want to recognize our leader, Dean Page, who's a dogged supporter of gender equity. He attends every single one of these events unless he's traveling, and even when he's traveling, sometimes he appears as well. So he's really dedicated to fostering equity in our environment, and he knows it's critically important. So I want to give him a couple of moments to say a word and say hello.
Thank you, Dr. Doherty. And actually, it's selfish on my standpoint because I learned so much by attending these events. And I will get out of your way very soon so we can all listen to Dr. Love's talk. I do just want to acknowledge the Gender Equity Steering Committee and all the efforts that have gone into this. And specifically, Dr. Doherty as Director of Gender Equity, Dr. Conant being here and as loyal as a loyal participant as any of us, and to the many people who are on the line today. Believe it or not, we're going through the dates, and we're starting our 5th academic year of this gender equity education series. And in that setting, this isn't on the script, but I think we should acknowledge Ann Doherty. Dr. Doherty has done an amazing job with this series. We keep coming back because we keep learning more, and this is such an important area, and Dr. Doherty represents it so well. I'd like to offer a virtual round of applause to Ann Doherty and thank her for her service. And with that, I'll get out of your way and look forward to learning from Dr. Love. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dean Page. I really appreciate your allyship. And now let's move on to the main event. I encountered Tiffany Love at the Brave Enough conference in Scottsdale, Arizona last year. And this is a meeting focused on women in medicine and science. And I was so excited to learn that she was a local Vermonter. And I immediately knew that we needed to have her voice as part of the gender equity education series. So a little bit about Dr. Love. She is the founder and CEO of the Love Leadership Foundation. She's an award-winning keynote speaker and a C-suite executive with over 30 years of healthcare experience. She's a fellow and former regent of the American College of Healthcare Executives. And she is by practice an adult, or by trade an adult and gerontological nurse practitioner. She's also a certified public leader from the Harvard Kennedy School. She serves as a coordinator, nurse planner, and guest faculty member at the Harvard Medical School's course, Career Advancement and Leadership Skills for Women in Healthcare, which is an amazing course that people should look into if they're interested in developing leadership skills. She's an advisory council member for the Harvard Business Review. Additionally, Dr. Love is an advisory board member for Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society's Center for Excellence in Nursing Education and an advisor for their Nurse Leadership Academy for Practice. Until very recently, she was the Associate Vice President and Chief Nursing Officer at UVM Health Network Porter Medical Center, and that was after serving 8 years in various roles in the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. She will present her talk titled Leading the Way to Equity, Creating a Safe Environment for All today. And I just want to make one quick note that there is link to live captioning in the chat for those who want to access it. Dr. Love, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. So I am going to share my screen. And let me just get it so I can go to.
And while you're doing that, I will just say we're going to utilize the Q&A tab for questions, and we'll have time for questions at the end.
Wonderful. Can you all see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So the title of my talk is Leading the Way to Equity, Creating Safe and Equitable Work Environments for All. Now, my objective today is to describe the characteristics of a safe and equitable work environment, and also share some of the evidence-based strategies that I have used to do this work in my own healthcare organizations, and also to talk about some of the adverse effects when you don't have a healthy work environment. So I'm going to level set with you on some of the terms I'm going to use. So one of the terms you will hear me use is the C-suite. The C-suite is referencing the top leaders in an organization who typically have the title chief in their name. So within most health hospitals, you will find a chief executive officer, who is the leader of the group. You will hear about the chief operating officer, who is typically the second in command. You will have a chief nursing officer, a chief medical officer, a chief financial officer. And if you Google an org chart for an organization, you will see tons of varieties of how these are set up. But I want you to know, when I refer to C-suite, I'm talking to this group of leaders. And the CEO is hired by the board of trustees. Also, when I use the term gender, I want you to think very inclusively. I want to make sure that people on the call know that when I'm referring to gender, I am trying to be very inclusive of people who are non-binary, however you identify. And I shared this HBR podcast because one of the ways we create inclusion in safe and equitable work environments is acknowledging gender diversity. And this has a really great guide on how to have some of these conversations. All right, so when it comes to healthcare globally, women make up 70% of the healthcare workforce, yet they only make up 25% of leadership. When we look at the American Hospital Association data, we find that 89% of CEOs identify as being white, while only 60% of the population identify as white. So this tells us that our C-suites within the healthcare organizations in America are approximately 89% white male. And so when you look at who's graduating from graduate level programs who would have the background in healthcare administration to lead healthcare organizations, we see that 46% identify as racially or ethnically diverse, and 64% identify as female. They didn't share any other gender identity information, but you have to ask the question, why are we seeing such a power gap or a leadership gap? Now, this particular research was just published recently that looks at the power gap within academia. And it noted that even though every year you have more than 50% of women who are getting PhDs, they still are not getting the top leadership roles within academia. So that's looking at president, provost, or being over the academic system. And why is that gap still there? And when you look at the data from this particular research, there out of the 130, they call them elite universities, the ones that are classified as R1 because of their research, you will see that there are a large number of universities that have never had a woman in those top positions, which we refer to as an inexorable zero. And so it's important to understand that this research is out there and start to dig into it and figure out why. Because clearly there are women qualified for these roles, but they're still not getting the top spot. Now, why should we care? Well, it's because the C-suite leaders are the gatekeepers. They are the decision makers. They have access to all the pay data within the organizations. They're the ones that are making decisions about pay and promotion for employees as well as contractors. Whenever there is a situation with harassment that requires an investigation, these are the people that are making the decisions about what actions will be taken to address harassment of any kind. They are deciding about capital investments, where we're going to put our money. They're making decisions about information technology. And if you ever work in electronic health records, or I don't know what systems you use within academia, but these are very important decisions that affect our day-to-day work. They're also the ones that lead incident command for any internal or external disasters. And they're the ones that negotiate contracts with vendors or with the unions if you're a unionized organization. Also, as a leader, one of the most important responsibilities we have is for the culture of the organization, making sure that our employees in our community feel safe on our premises. We're responsible for ensuring financial stability so that we can be there for our community. And we are the ones that are ultimately responsible for compliance and held accountable for meeting local, federal laws and regulations. And so we're often the legally responsible party, which is a lot of responsibility. And so right now, if you would take a look at Becker's healthcare review, you know that healthcare organizations are truly the C-suite is a stressful place to work. We are seeing hospitals every day that are dealing with bankruptcies. We've experienced the escalated labor costs because of having to use contract labor to fill in the gaps for vacancies. We know that when it comes to reimbursement, insurers are lagging behind the inflation, so we're not getting paid for the actual cost of care. We're seeing a lot of turnover in leadership, and organizations are also starting to not just downsize their leadership teams, but also downsizing frontline staff. So this is a truly stressful environment for C-suite leaders. And you know what? It is so sad to say that when there is downsizing, especially when you do it based on tenure, the first people to be downsized or to be eliminated are the people who bring the diversity to our organization. So whenever there's a downsize, typically you will say the last hired is the first fired, right? Because they had the least amount of tenure. The non-essential workers, or people who are considered to be non-essential, and people who they feel that there's a redundancy in their position and we can eliminate this position, save money, and just add those additional duties to someone else. Well, when this occurs, we immediately see a drop in white and Hispanic women and Black, Hispanic, and Asian men in management. So whenever there's a downsizing, there's an immediate elimination of diversity. Now, just to be very clear, the barriers that I see to having a safe and equitable work environment are unequal pay and promotion, when there's a culture where harassment exists and is pervasive, where there's a threat of physical violence. And in Vermont, there's been a lot of work and a lot of legislation towards creating a environment, especially in healthcare, that is safe from physical violence. And then, of course, the threat of being exposed to life-threatening illnesses. Now, this report was a very important report, one of the first ones that came out from the national academies that really looked at women leaving healthcare. The impact of COVID-19 on women exiting the workforce was tremendous. And this report actually only looked at the beginning of women leaving the workforce. So in this report, we know that healthcare is one of the largest employment sectors in the United States, and it's a female-dominated industry. And in April 2020, we had already lost 12% of women from all disciplines from healthcare versus 6% of men. So it's not that we didn't lose men, we just lost a lot more women. Why are women leaving? When I look at this list of reasons why women are leaving, these are things that we knew existed prior to the pandemic. Feeling like they have unsafe workloads, feelings of guilt or failure to meet the demands of the job, pay inequities, demanding schedules, lack of promotion, harassment of all kind, lack of childcare and adult care, and lack of paid family leave. And all of this results in us just feeling burned out. So for me in my personal life, as well as my professional life, I have set priorities and goals for what I hope to accomplish in my career. And I was so happy to see that this current administration has also set out a national strategy on gender equity and equality. And my goals align very much with their goals. So if you know me, or if you've ever heard me speak before, you know I feel very passionate about closing the pay gap. I don't think we ever should have told women that they had to wait hundreds of years to have equitable pay. So I hope we stop telling people that. Also, to eliminate discrimination or harassment of any kind, making sure that everyone has the equal opportunity for skill development, making sure they have the equal opportunity for advancement, and also making sure that we are intentional about creating career paths for the underserved people in our community. So there is some new research out hot off the press that is dispelling the myth about women negotiating pay. Now, years ago, it was true that women were less likely to negotiate their pay. However, the research shows that that trend has changed. So now, a recent survey that came out of Vanderbilt shows that 64% of men and 47% of women are negotiating their job offers. And the women still are having a median salary of 83% compared to men, or you could say 83% of what a man earns. If a woman has an MBA, then it goes up another 5%. And the sad thing is the gap in pay widens over the years, and it's of course always worse if it is a woman of color. And so now that we know that women do ask and attempt to negotiate their pay, we want to start to dispel that belief and really think about what's happening. So are women being told no more often than men? Because the research in this particular study says that, yeah, that's really the problem now. It's not the women are asking, it's that they're being told no. And is it really a flawed expectation for us to expect for anyone to negotiate their salary? Should we have legislation that enforces a fair and equitable wage across the board? These are some of the things that the study looked at. And of course, you know, when it comes to legislation in the United States, the answer pretty much was no for the people who attempted to do that. You can diagnose gender inequity within your organization, and it's not very hard. And these are the dimensions of inequity that you could look at: pay, representation at different levels of leadership, development opportunities, retention, opportunities to advance, and belonging. And so when it comes to compensation, we talk about the gender pay gap, but also it's important to look at if there are any racial or ethnic inequities. When it comes to representation, we have already started to identify that when it comes to the top paid positions, that's where you're lacking the diversity, you're lacking a lot of women. When it comes to job satisfaction, I am one who doesn't like to rely on surveys. I really like leadership rounding me because there are so many people, if they're vulnerable, they're afraid to be honest in a survey. And then looking at development, are people getting those stretch assignments? Are women getting those interim leadership assignments? Are they being sponsored by their bosses? And then retention, if you have a retention problem, it's probably due to a cultural problem or even a pay inequity problem. And then there are times where you will see diverse leaders will advance to that first level of leadership and then get stuck. The research shows that many people don't advance beyond that first level of leadership if they are a woman or a person of color. And belonging, I think belonging is probably my favorite word of 2023. I see this word so differently now as I think about what does inspire a true sense of belonging. And so these are the dimensions. These are the key metrics that you would look at. I will say that this article is from 2021. I feel like the definition of belonging has changed for me. It's so much more than job satisfaction, but just know that there are simple analysis that you can do to identify if you have a problem at your organization. So as someone who identifies as a Black woman, I am almost always the only C-suite executive, no matter where I work. And the research shows that this creates a tremendous psychological and physiological burden, especially when you're in an environment where you're always navigating aggression, or which is referred to a lot of times as good intentions. Oh, they didn't intend to say that, they didn't intend to do this. But when it becomes a pattern of behavior, then you have to start asking the question, okay, is this person actually making the effort to do better? Because there comes a point in time when good intentions just aren't enough. And in this particular research study, they talked about how women of color have to navigate these all the time, especially unfounded complaints, racial gaslighting. One example that always comes to mind when I think, what is racial gaslighting? Saying things like, oh, slavery was good for Black people. They learned skills. And understanding that when you are a woman or a person of color, you're actually having to navigate a different set of rules. You're dealing with navigating gender norms. And when you're a person of color, there are certain norms and expectations that people have of you that are just due to bias and daily acts of exclusion. So not being invited to the meeting that you should be in, or other things that make you feel like you're not a part of the group or that leadership team. And so it results in people like myself feeling as if you're always at risk. And as you can imagine, this creates a threat to the brain. Can you imagine walking into a work environment every day where you are constantly on guard that someone's going to say or do something offensive, or that they are actually excluding you? And I will tell you that as much as you try to do yoga or take a walk, the impact on your mental and physical health is very real. And as we know, the body keeps score. So it's really an unhealthy environment. And that's why it's so important for us to do the work to make sure that people feel psychologically safe at work. Now, I wish that I could poll the people on this call to ask you, has anyone ever told you, no matter what happens, never go to HR? And when I read this at the very beginning, this wasn't even in the book. It was at the very beginning of the book where a woman is telling a story about how she had gotten her first corporate job. And one of the things her mom said to her was, no matter what happens, never go to HR. That makes me feel so sad as a leader, because I would like to think that I'm creating a culture where people feel safe to come forward when things are happening to them that should not be happening in the workplace. But the truth of the matter is retaliation is real, and a lot of people don't feel safe to come forward. And so I hope that the leaders on the call will join me in trying to create an environment where someday people won't advise each other that whatever happens, never go to HR. So if you are the only woman, please know that there are healthcare organizations or any organization out there that will value you, will treat you with respect and civility. And it's not worth the physical and mental stress that it puts on your body. So know that you can leave. Until you leave, find strategies to cope. Like I mentioned, making sure you're getting enough rest, yoga, walking, exercise. Also, find a support network that can help you navigate this time, and then plan an exit strategy. But whatever you do, I don't advise that you stay in a work environment where you don't feel valued or welcome. Now, recently, there have been some Supreme Court decisions that have caused many of us hiring officials to feel very unsettled, and it really hit academia the hardest. So we know that affirmative action cannot be used in academia anymore. And we know that it has always been illegal to hire someone based on race or sex. However, it's so important that we don't let this discourage us from collecting the demographic data that tells us about who's coming into our organizations based on race and sex. This data is still valuable and helpful. It will help you identify, are there racial or gender gaps in certain positions where you're seeing a lot of turnover? And it'll help you drill down to some of the root causes of why. It'll help you identify if with any particular hiring officials, if there is some type of discrimination that's happening in that process, because hiring practices are typically where you will find the most inequities. And so, of course, if there is, the most important thing you can do is identify it and address it. You can do pay equity audits. You can do everything to remove barriers to advancement, such as making sure that everyone has the opportunity to get that stretch assignment or to get that interim leadership role. Now, when it comes to hiring in particular, there's something known as the Mansfield Rule or the inclusion rider. And for example, how you use that is when you're hiring into a position, you can say, we're not going to move forward to the next step of the hiring process until I have at least 30% of the applicants that are women. Of course, they're all meeting the qualifications for the job. You're just saying that before I move forward, I want to make sure that we have reached out to all, qualified individuals. And at a minimum, we have to have 30% of those candidates be women. And then most importantly, disrupt that feeling of a lack of community support and belonging wherever you identify it in your organization. Managing team bias can be really tricky. So you have several different types of bias that we are familiar with. First, the affinity bias, which we consider to be unintentional. Then you have prejudice, which we know is intentional. And then we have bullying, which we know is when someone intends to cause harm. And as a leader, this is probably one of the most challenging responsibilities we have is to address these behaviors. But it's important to know that you have to do it no matter how hard it is, because whether it's intentional or not, it is still hurting people. The Joint Commission has been really good at looking at workplace incivility. So here it describes examples of workplace incivility, feeling a threat to your professional status, your personal standing, when someone withholds information from you, or one that's not particularly noted here, when someone gives you a goal or a deadline, and then they're constantly moving the goal or the deadline. And so, of course, as you would imagine, I'm sure many of you have experienced this at some point in your careers. It makes it for a very unpleasant place to work. And the Joint Commission did issue a Sentinel event alert very recently in January 2022, so that it could bring our awareness to the fact of the physical and verbal violence against healthcare workers and how detrimental it is to our ability to provide care. And so I want you to take a moment to think about, if you are in a situation where you have to save someone's life and you're working side by side with someone who makes you feel unsafe, then that makes the environment unsafe for the patient. So that is just one example of why we must address any threat of verbal or physical violence for our healthcare workers, as well as people working in any environment. Now, when you start to assess and address the bias that might be on your team, it's really important to think about the bias that people have is because of their individual lived experiences, but also their past trauma. And I would say over the last 2 years, this has really informed the way that I lead and the way that I address others, because people bring their trauma to work, whether it's trauma from their personal life or their professional life. So as you try to address behaviors and bias, it's really important to think about what is feeding this behavior. And of course, as you all may have thought about, the media has a big impact on how we develop our bias, as well as the other information that we take into our environment. So as you're doing the good work of addressing bias in the workplace, just keep all of this in mind, and the fact that the person you're trying to manage may be dealing with some trauma that is showing up in the workplace. So when it comes to affinity bias, as I mentioned before, it typically comes up in the hiring process. And I will tell you that being a leader of other leaders who are hiring into roles, I very much do ask to look at their process to make sure that they are not introducing bias into the way they are selecting or hiring people. And so one good way to challenge whether you're being biased in your decision making is to perform a flip test. Let's just give an example. If you decide not to hire a woman for a role and you say, oh, well, she's got a lot of young kids. Well, would you say that if it was a male that you were hiring? If that is the case, then you're introducing bias into your decision making process. Now, for quite some time now, we know that diversity trainings often don't work, and they often will lead to backlash and retaliation. But there are some studies that are coming up with some bias-focused trainings that are actually effective in just helping people acknowledge when they are more likely to discriminate against women, or when there are policies that are disadvantageous to women. And so in this particular research study, they used some bias-focused training, and it actually was effective. And I will tell you that during my time at Porter Medical Center, I did introduce a Microsoft training on bias, which actually was an award-winning training. So there are trainings, experiences that do work, but for the most part, when it comes to diversity trainings, a lot of them are not effective. So as you are contemplating what you will do to address bias and behaviors in your organization, you want to be very thoughtful and look at the research to identify the proper type of training so that you don't have that backlash that so many people experience. And just to really emphasize this particular article here, it says very little evidence. There was very little evidence that diversity training affected the behavior of men or white employees overall. So just keep that in mind, especially in a place like Vermont, where the racial ethnic makeup is predominantly white. And when it comes to measuring inclusion, it's really not that difficult. When you think about the 7 dimensions of inclusion, and like I said, belonging is my new favorite, there are ways to measure this. It can be really simple. Again, a lot of people choose to do it through surveys. I prefer to do it through leadership rounding. And I will say, take the surveys that you have and definitely look at the data, but also make sure to do face-to-face rounding to see if you're getting the same results when you ask people. Because again, sometimes people are afraid to say how they really feel in a survey. So when it comes to building a culture of belonging, I like to emphasize how someone's uniqueness is bringing a valuable contribution to the group. I really encourage coworkers to support each other, and I like to also assess whether I'm giving them the support they need just by asking, always making sure I'm asking, how can I help? Supporting their daily work and also their career development, asking people, how can I support you in doing the work that you're doing today? But also, do you have career goals? Is there something that I can do to help you advance within our organization? I think that's a great retention tool. And it also encourages people to be proud of the organization that they work for when they feel like people there care about them. And that does inspire that feeling of belonging. So that is the end of my talk. I'm going to stop sharing and open up for questions.
So again, as a reminder, we are using the Q&A function for questions. So if folks want to type their questions into the Q&A, we will be looking at those. And I'm glad that we have some time. To kick that off, as folks start to think about their questions, first, Dr. Love, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today and giving us, I think, a really nice overview of how we can all work towards building a more equitable work environment and providing some concrete and helpful strategies that we can use to help close some of those gender inequities and really foster that sense of belonging. I think that word belonging really resonates with me, with a lot of us here. You had mentioned in your talk that some of your personal gender equity priorities are to ensure an equal opportunity for both skill development and advancement. What advice do you have for leaders who may want to create these opportunities for underrepresented individuals in leadership positions, really beyond that first level of leadership? As you know, in academic medicine, we often see that the promotion pathway kind of changes as folks move up that career ladder. You know, there's generally a relatively proportional kind of number of men versus women and gender minorities kind of at that initial assistant professor level. And as folks move on the ranks, we see a drop off in women and gender minorities who get promoted to associate professor and then full professor. So the question is, how do you help people get unstuck? How do you provide those opportunities for that advancement and skill development?
So first, I would sit down with those leaders and do an assessment and identify what are the gaps. So looking at the criteria for promotion, really sit down with them and identify where the gaps are. So in academia, oftentimes it's being published in peer-reviewed journals, or maybe you might need to secure grant money to really be considered to get that top spot to become a full professor or tenured faculty. And so what I really take the time to do is sit down, identify where the gaps are, and then start to make a plan with that leader on how to address it. You know, I have been so fortunate to work under Dr. Julie Silver at Harvard, who is very good about getting people together to publish together, getting people together for sponsor parties. So, you know, when it comes to sponsorship, a lot of times people really don't know how to ask for a sponsor. I will tell you in my career, I have been sponsored sometimes unknowingly by others. And so really, I would say it's just a matter of, for me as a leader, number one, showing that I want to support their career advancement, and then identifying very concrete steps they need to take to get there and setting smart goals for them to do that.
Thank you. I think that's some helpful kind of concrete advice and guidance. We do have one question here from an attendee who asks, do you consider disability a factor among women in the healthcare setting? How does it play in women experience in the woman experience in employment and healthcare? Big and small hospitals often neglect or try to cheat the accommodation in spite of ADA.
Yes, so there is actually a very, I want to say famous. I feel like she's famous because I know her. Her name is Sherry Blount. I'm not gonna spell her name correctly, but she is a female physician who is also a para-Olympian. And yes, disability does come into play, especially if it's an observable disability, and we really don't do a very good job. We are a very ableist society. It comes down to accessibility for parking, for your desks, different accommodations that a lot of people don't think of. And so really, I think we probably do a poor job of, number one, assessing and asking the individuals how we can better support them in their work. I know the things that I'm saying are probably so simple and small, but I would imagine they probably make more of a difference than we even realize. And so in that particular instance, I would say we need to do a better job of asking the question of the individuals to make sure that we are providing everything they need so that they have an equitable opportunity for advancement like others.
Thank you. Another question here. Do you have any strategies for calling out affinity bias, especially when folks are resistant to the flip test that you described?
Yes, so I actually love that you asked this question. So I can remember someone who I love dearly who said that, oh, we should call people out. When someone's being biased, call them out. Well, number one, I want us to be very thoughtful to stop asking BIPOC people to call people out. That's a very risky situation for someone who is already at risk. So when I say that, me as a Black woman, I don't feel comfortable calling someone out, especially if the person has made a biased statement on more than one occasion, because they stop focusing on the fact that they said or did something inappropriate, and they start to focus on the fact that you're calling them out. And that puts that person at risk. So I want to be thoughtful that we don't ask BIPOC people to call people out. And for me, when I have experienced bias or I witness bias, my first strategy is to try and have a conversation with that person outside of the situation to bring it to their attention. Hey, did you know when you said this, it made people or me feel this way? And then if they keep doing the same behaviors, then you have to really think about, are they making the effort to do better? Because the bottom line is some of it is intentional, some of it is just racism, and you have to address it that way. But yeah, there are a lot of strategies that people like to use, like saying ouch when someone says something or does something inappropriate. Ouch, that hurt. And I will say it's a really sensitive topic, or a sensitive, it's you have to be careful how you address it, because you don't want to push the person away when they might be actually open to hearing and understanding and making the effort to do better.
Yeah, I was thinking about something that I heard recently, and to be honest, I can't remember who it was or where at this point, but about moving away from calling someone out on what they're doing, right? Of, hey, I noticed you did this. And coming in with a sense of curiosity and calling someone in or pulling somebody into that conversation of being curious and say, oh, well, interesting. What did you mean by that? And inviting them to have that open conversation.
And that's another great strategy, asking the question to get more information, because maybe what they said, it came across as being biased, but they just didn't give you all the full information that they were thinking of in their head. And once you ask the question, it gives them the opportunity to explain. And then you realize, oh, well, maybe they weren't being biased. They just didn't share their full thought.
I think we have time for a handful more questions. So if folks want to continue to type them in, thank you very much. We do have a couple here. One, let's see. Can you speak to age and belonging and helpful means of bringing different generations, different perspectives, also including retired or emeritus faculty together in teams? And so when there are different cultures, different perspectives, certainly ageism is another form of discrimination as well. And how do you navigate that?
Well, and it's so interesting because that ageism goes both ways.
Mhm.
Just like older people tend to, I hate to say discriminate against younger people, they often do. And where you will find it, particularly with Gen Z, is the assumption of a lack of commitment. So typically the Gen Z generation, like if you aren't giving them a flexible work schedule or equitable pay, they are not hanging around for long. And I always like to talk to my older leaders to say, that's admirable. Just think about the fact that you want work-life balance. If you can't have it, you're out of here. I mean, I don't want it to sound as if I think it's okay to be non-committal, but think about, our parents. They probably had the same job most of their life, and no matter how good or bad, they never left. So the way that I try to address the ageism when one of the leaders comes to me with that perspective, I try and kind of flip it to let them understand the other person's perspective and to kind of demonstrate how we can learn from other generations, as well as with a younger generation, helping demonstrate the value of having our more senior leaders, our more senior faculty, because there's so much that they can teach us and offer to us. So I think my number one way to do that is to help us look for the value in others and highlighting their uniqueness and what they're bringing to the organization or conversation. And then when it comes to our hybrid world, I think it's really important, or hybrid, virtual, I think it's really important to give people options because some people don't feel comfortable sitting in front of a Zoom call. So give them options where they feel comfortable joining the meeting, or even making sure that we make it as easy as possible for them to interact and engage in the way that they feel comfortable.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thank you. I know we, in our department, we're also navigating through the hybrid option, right? In terms of making sure that meetings and educational sessions are as accessible as possible for everyone. So we have a couple more questions. There's one that I'm hoping that we can get a little bit more clarity on that has to do with educating HR and reimbursement. So if you type that question in, can you re-ask the question or clarify that? While we give you time to do that, I'm going to move on to another question that's actually also with HR, I believe. It says, if there's an issue that makes a workplace environment unsafe, and HR isn't worth going to HR to talk about that. Is the only option for the person facing the unsafe work environment is to leave? I mean, I think you had that slide where it said, have an exit strategy.
Right.
Are there other things that we can do individually as a whole to not have to resort to that?
Absolutely. So there absolutely are other strategies. If you don't have confidence that HR will take the right step, you can look to leadership, look at the leadership team and identify, is there someone who you feel safe to go to with whatever the concern is. Even if it's not your direct supervisor, it might be someone who can advise you or who can advocate for on your behalf to address whatever the situation is. And I have found myself in that situation where the problem was not with someone who reported up to me necessarily, but with another VP. And so then I will take on that responsibility of bringing that problem forward to that other leader and setting that expectation that we need to do something about it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then one strategy that folks are using, and I know you've given some very clear strategies, clear measurements in terms of how to close the gender pay gap and gender, and you know, have more equity. Can you comment about using salary, transparency in salary as a way to create or force salary equity?
Yes, so it's so interesting. This is one of my favorite topics. So number one, I do think that we should be transparent about salaries. Most organizations are not. And I always like to tell leaders, if people are not being paid equitably, they are very aware that they're not being paid equitably. So not sharing salary data is actually not very helpful. It's not helpful to you because they're going to share the information anyway. And so when it comes to trying to address it, number one, I definitely think it should be transparent, but I definitely think the expectation should be set that there is a salary audit to identify if there are inequities. And many times in my career, I have found inequities. And so even though you cannot necessarily lower someone's pay to be in line with everyone else's, you can look at how can you increase pay so that everyone is getting paid a fair and equitable wage. And I will tell you that during my time at Porter, I did negotiate 2 pay raises to, number one, not just address pay inequities within the organization, but also so that their pay is more competitive to those same job roles in the region. So when we think about pay equity, we need to not just think about within our organization, but also in the competing organizations around us, because you don't want to necessarily be the pay leader, but you don't want to be at the bottom either. So you got to find the right sweet spot in the middle.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then thank you for the individual for clarifying your question here. So they note, reimbursement is a financial barrier for the working class employment, especially they've just strengthened their stability financially. However, you know, these individuals may travel a long trip to a conference for professional development. You know, those are pretty expensive, can be expensive.
I think I understand where this question is going. So
there's a tight budget to pay for hotel, food,
right.
tickets. HR reimburse them after the conference, but it'll drown them in debt to try and continue to do these. Right?
And some people just don't have the money to pay up front. And so I really do believe it should be on the organization to pay for that hotel stay, that airfare, whatever, in advance. You know, typically when it comes to career development or skill development, we are investing in our future. It's a succession plan, right? We want people to stay with our organization. We want to invest in their skill development. And that's really how we should approach it. So we shouldn't expect for people to always pay upfront, especially for those lower paying roles, because we know they don't often have that wiggle room in their budget to spend thousands of dollars and wait for reimbursement to come in a check.
And let's see. And do we have time for any more here? I'm realizing I can't find the time on my.
It is 12:54.
Oh,
yeah,
perfect.
I think we do have time for one other question. And if you don't have a question there, I do have a question.
Okay.
My question is about, you know, you had said, Dr. Love, that you don't want to have someone in a decision-making process or hiring process or promotion process say things like, well, she has so many kids, or make a like a clearly gendered comment. And I think most of us at this point at this institution would agree that that's not an appropriate way to evaluate a candidate, though it sometimes does happen. But my curiosity is like, how do you address some of the surrogates for comments like that? Like, she only has 10 papers. She's only on 2 national committees. And sometimes I feel like they're comments that would not be a factor if the person had a majority identity or was male in the situation, but if you're BIPOC or a woman or have an intersectional identity, that comes up as a stumbling block to promotion, hiring, et cetera. How do you address situations like that?
So I typically use a scoring grid, and I use that also so that I can always look back and be very clear on how and why decisions were made. And on the scoring grid, when I'm hiring for any position, you can put in there whatever you want, whether you want them to have a PhD, whether you want them to have 2 papers or 10 papers. You, as the hiring official, really should have enough flexibility where you determine what the criteria is. And so when people come forward with comments like that, hopefully you can say, well, that's actually not a part of the scoring for this role. And you can redirect them that way. And that's how I have managed to eliminate some of the bias in hiring positions. So I use performance-based interview questions. I use the scoring grid for the resume. I also use a scoring grid for the interview process. And when we're sharing information, sharing feedback about what we thought about the candidate, I always make sure I go last, because whatever I say, other people are going to probably follow my lead. And I always choose on the most quiet person to speak first, and the more vocal personalities to speak last.
And yes, I really like the idea of the leaders going last, which is something that interestingly I don't see happen in academic medicine. I think in academic medicine, it's often the highest ranking person in the room who gets to ask the first question, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a great reminder for us, for sure. And then I wonder, just in the couple of minutes we have left, can you speak a little bit about how we can organize ourselves institutionally to make sure that there are the stretch roles or the interim roles that can be used as a stepping stone for women to get into those more traditional, like dean level leadership positions, and ways you've seen institutions that really foster those like mini steppings or the stepping stones to leadership?
Absolutely. So I think about this in 2 different ways. So whenever there's a vacancy or someone steps away, or even if someone just goes on vacation a week, that is a time where you can put someone as the acting in their role, right? While they're away on vacation, you have someone, and I like to make it fair, working in the government, you had to always make sure that everyone had the opportunity to apply and compete for whatever the opportunity is, or even just making sure that you rotate the opportunity. So you can do it for when people are on extended leave. But most importantly, when there's a vacancy, don't just leave it vacant and reassign the responsibilities. Give someone the opportunity to serve as interim. And that's really, on the job interview. So I really do like to do it that way.
Beautiful. Thank you. And this will be the last question, and we don't have very much time, but this will be the last question.
Okay.
How do I advocate to expand the paid sick, personal, and vacation time for executives? A lot of industries only provide them with 2 weeks of time off in 6 months or once a year, and I think it's mentally brutal to their well-being.
Actually in the UVM Health Network, we went to the executive leaders having unlimited sick time. And the reason that they did that was to get the financial burden off the books. So that can be your argument to say, you know, you don't have that financial debt on the books. You can talk to your CFO about this. You don't have that financial debt on the books if you just let people have unlimited CTO. And what you will find that is that even though people have unlimited CTO, they don't become egregious about taking it. Most people hate to take time away from work. So that's what I would suggest as a strategy, and you can see how UVM is doing with that.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us, for sharing your wisdom and experience. We really appreciate it. And I also want to let folks know that we put a link for our listserv in the chat, so you can access that and get updates about gender equity at the Lerner College of Medicine. Also, this talk was recorded, so if colleagues who aren't here want to listen to it, you can go to the library tab, the video library tab on the ODEI website, and I think maybe Emily or Krista can put that in the chat. I want to thank Tiffany Delaney, the director of our office, Emily Imarino and Krista Kohler, who are the champion organizers in our office, Bruce Kimball and the ComAV team, who keep this ship running smoothly, and also Christine, who did our closed captioning today. Our next session is going to be on October 11th. It's a panel discussion on paths to leadership, and our panelists will be Jason Sanders, Deborah Leonard, and Beth Kirkpatrick, who will be talking about their own unique journeys to leadership. And I hope you can join us. So stay tuned. And I hope everyone has a great rainy Wednesday. Thank you.